Good afternoon, and to those folks joining us from the West Coast, good morning. My name is Mallory Hennig, and I am the Development Coordinator for Annual Giving and Planned Giving at Conservation International. I would like to thank you for joining our Emerald Circle webinar and for your generous support of CI. It's donors like you who make our work possible, and we're very grateful for your commitment to conservation. I'm so glad you're joining us for our Emerald Circle webinar. We have an exciting topic and speaker that I'm excited to introduce in a moment, but first, a few housekeeping items. The audio for today's webinar is through your computer or the device you are using to stream today's webinar. You can adjust the volume through your device as needed. We will be using the built-in chat feature today, so you should see a box on the right-hand side of your screen that says chat. You can use this to add your questions, and we will save time at the end to answer your questions. If for some reason we're unable to answer all the questions or we don't get to your question, we will be certain to follow up. But again, chat us with your questions or comments, and we will be happy to address them. Finally, we do record these presentations, and we will be sending out a link in follow-up so that you can watch the recording or share it with others. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today's webinar on protecting families by protecting lobsters, transforming conservation in the Galapagos. Scott Henderson is Conservation International's Vice President of the Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape. He pioneered our Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape Initiative, which has been recognized by the United Nations as a global model for regional marine management. Scott earned his master's in science at Oxford with honors in environmental change and management. Today, Scott will share CI's work in the Galapagos of creating conservation stewards from lobstermen, expanding our learning internationally, and protecting one of the Earth's most exquisite areas. So now I'm very pleased to turn it over to Scott.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Mallory. And thanks to all of you from the Emerald Circle. Obviously, it's thanks to people like you and our many other donors that we can do the work we do. And what I'd like to do today, just for 25 minutes or so, is share what I think is a model conservation success and put it in the context of CI's larger initiatives. So as many of you know, Conservation International, we're framing our work around four kind of pillars of work: tropical forest for climate, ocean conservation at scale, innovation in science and finance, and then the sort of thing that the story I'm going to tell you about Galapagos contributes to is called sustainable landscapes and seascapes, which is, a lot of our field-based work and work where we're trying to put it all together in the things we've done over the last 30 years. And the kind of thing I'm going to talk to you about that happened in Galapagos is the kind of experience, just one of many, one of hundreds of experiences that we're drawing on to frame the Sustainable Landscapes and Seascapes program. So as a young boy in the flat farmlands of central Ohio, for as long as I can remember, like up there in that upper left photo, that's actually me with my dad sitting in central Ohio on a farm I grew up on. I had this absolute fascination with tropical islands. And for as long as I can remember, even my friends from elementary school, I always said I was going to be a marine biologist. I was going to live in Hawaii. I was going to save dolphins and all that sort of thing. And I was very fortunate in that, I was able to make that dream come true, a dream from a very early age. And interestingly, in many ways, my own kind of evolution from a small kid in Ohio to, a conservationist and a vice president at Conservation International, in many ways, it parallels Conservation International's own evolution over the last 30 years. Incidentally, I've been for a little over 30 years in the Galapagos, and these pictures kind of capture a little bit of that evolution in some of those stages. So, I was a guide in the Galapagos from 1983, spent a lot of time out in the islands, got to see lots of things. I'll tell you a little bit more about that momentarily. A coffee farmer. I've got the largest and only certified organic farm in the Galapagos, where I've had to come to terms with the harsh realities of taking my own advice and having to pay for it. I often say it's what made me the most effective conservationist of all, was having to pay for my own free advice. And then down below, I've run the local school in Galapagos now, and That's obviously a huge responsibility, and where you see how conservation and society really interfaces to the title of this presentation on protecting families, because ultimately that's what we do as CIs. We're about human well-being through nature-based solutions. And then finally, the most important of all is being a dad, and that's my little son there, an area in Galapagos. So you might think it was this guy that was my motivation to become a conservationist in the Galapagos, or a scientist in Galapagos. I'm sure many of you recognize this is Charles Darwin, kind of the guy who in many ways put Galapagos on the map. And to this day, so many of our local institutions and streets and all these sorts of things bear his name. But actually it was this guy. And then this is in all seriousness, although it might seem kind of hard to believe. For those who don't know who this is, anyone probably under 30 or maybe over 90, this is the professor on Gilligan's Island. And the professor on Gilligan's Island could solve any problem. For one thing, they lived on what it seemed to me this spectacularly beautiful tropical island. I think it's where I first in the late 60s got the idea that I wanted to live on a tropical island. But the thing about this guy was, by thinking it through with a little bit of duct tape and baling wire and plastic washed up on the beach, although there wasn't nearly as much back then as there is now, he could solve a problem. He could make a radio, fashion a vaccine. He could do just about anything. And in 1983, I got my opportunity, and this is one of the things I saw. This is not a picture I took at that time, but I went out as an undergrad at Washington University in Virginia, incidentally, where I'll be tonight, visiting the same supervisor that took me there 36 years ago. And I got a chance to see this. And for anyone who's not been to the Galapagos Islands, this is why you go. This is why you went 35 years ago, when people were just starting to realize that Galapagos is one of the great hot spots on Earth for large pelagic animals, in particular hammerhead sharks. And seeing this image and matching that up to all those years of expectation I've had made me decide right then and there, I'm taking my junior year off of college, I'm moving back here, I'm going to become a guide. And that's actually what I did. And during that year, I saw a lot of things. But even today, I should note, this picture that you're seeing of these hammerheads, to this very day, today, you can see the same image. Whereas so many places around the world, 35 years later, you can't see this anymore. They're gone. Most of the places in Mexico also used to be able to see these sorts of large schools of hammerheads, and you can't see them anymore. Galapagos, you still can. But during that year, I also saw something else. I'd never really fancied myself to be much of a fisherman or even particularly a seafood eater. But during that year, I saw things like this, massive, massive lobsters. I wasn't like a professional lobster fisherman, but I had the opportunity to, right off the shore of the little village, which I lived in then, which I still live in to this day. I'm still a full-time resident in Galapagos. We were able to get out and find giant lobsters like this one. But I also saw this, that very year, I saw something that very few people on Earth have ever seen, which is a marine extinction. When I got there in 1983, we could see mats. Actually, by that time they were dying off of this kelp you see on the left side of the screen. And by just 1984, because of a very high temperatures during an El Nino year, all that kelp died off. And incredibly, that kelp you see on the left side there, that was an endemic species, a species found nowhere else on Earth, a species very important to things like healthy lobster populations and lots of other marine organisms in ocean health in general. But those high temperatures resulted in the loss of all that kelp, and every single individual on Earth died off because of that one event. And to this day, those kind of scrubbed rocks on the right are the way that looks. And that's right out in front of the Charles Darwin Research Station that bears that name of the famous scientist. So to fast forward, I was a guide, went back. My parents were very happy. I actually did finish my undergraduate degree. I moved back to Galapagos. I moved on from being a guide that showed people and looked at nature and photographed it to being a scientist. And in 1998, a sweeping piece of legislation came through, and the Ecuadorian government decided that science was good, but it wasn't solving a lot of the problems. What we needed was policy. We needed policy to guide management, and we needed management to deliver well-being to the residents of Galapagos. And just a few short years later, 6 years later, these are three headline news stories from major outlets at that time. In fact, I was, you see that National Public Radio reference at the bottom, scientists held hostage at Darwin's Island. I was one of those hostages. most of those fishermen were friends of mine, so they were pretty benign hostage takers. But they actually did lock us into a compound, wouldn't let us leave, threatened to kill giant tortoises, cut down a large swath of endemic forest, blocked tourists from getting to the famous visitor sites. And in general, it was mayhem because people were unhappy. They weren't seeing benefits, and they felt that that policy that was supposed to benefit them only regulated them. And that's one of the big problems and one of the takeaways from this talk and from where CI's gone is that regulation is fundamental and it's critical, but it's really it's about a lot more than that if you want to achieve conservation. So this next slide tells you just how bad it got in terms of not only were people upset, but they started killing off wildlife, saying this is a shark net. And the reason these shark nets were placed was largely because sea cucumber populations were plummeting. This was the high value resource. And from this graph I'm showing you now of lobster stocks, you don't need to look at the details other than the shape of that curve and the colors in that curve. Lobsters had traditionally been up around between 60 and 90 tons of catch. And right around the time of that law in 1998, they peaked around 2,000 at a pretty good catch, a little bit of post El Nino rebound. There had been a 98 El Nino, and after that, they'd come back quite well. And then they gradually declined down to that period I'm talking about in 2004 when there was all the social unrest and problems. And at that time, then lobster populations did what are called bumping along the bottom. In other words, they hung out around 20 tons, which was barely a viable, economically viable activity, but because all the sea cucumbers, which are even higher value, had been completely lost, fishermen started catching sharks to supplement their income and continued to catch lobsters at an unsustainable rate. And in 2009, CI and a bunch of other people, this is definitely not only a CI success story, there are many organizations, obviously the Galapagos National Park, for all the leadership they showed, for the Ecuadorian government, for providing the kind of support that we and other organizations needed, the openness to change, the fishermen themselves, organizations like WWF with whom we work very well, the Charles Darwin Research Station. So it was really a collective effort. But I will say that in 2009, CI, with the support of an organization called Helmsley Charitable Trust, really got in the game on lobster. And we saw this as an opportunity to change the way people viewed their relationship with nature. We did this hand in hand with another great organization, some of you will know, called RARE, because we're a partnership organization and we're a science-driven organization. So we look for those kinds of partners. And the solution was quite simple in description, not so simple to achieve in practice, but basically what had to happen was rather than regulating fisheries through seasons and catch and zoning only, all critical things was people needed to see benefits. And the problem was a market problem. And the problem was up through about 2009, as you can see from the height of the green bars, the market share for local, the local market share was very small. So nearly all of the lobster being sold were to the export market for frozen tails, a relatively low value resource. And what we saw as an opportunity was to encourage the boats and restaurants and hotels to start buying live lobster and selling it right there. And the kinds of things we had to do was build aquaria, teach them how to cook it, run cooking contests, and all sorts of things. And you can see how the recovery of lobster is roughly tracking the increase in the local market share of live lobster. Why is this important? The reason is because if you go out, hunt a lobster with a spear on scuba or through a compressor, when you spear it, pull it out and say, oh, what a shame, it was a female with eggs, or as an undersized lobster, it's too late. But if you stick your hand deep into a hole and pull out a lobster and you see that it doesn't have eggs, it's not part of the reproductive population at a critical moment, nor is it undersized, it's already had the opportunity to breed again, you can put it back. But you're not going to put it back if you're not getting benefits. And one of the beauty of this program is lobster fishermen are getting benefits. And this is where the prosperity is being built back into the system. So to kind of put this all together in a schematic and to make a little bit of a pivot to how does this story relate to our global sustainable landscapes and seascapes initiative, This first slide just shows the Galapagos Islands, a bunch of volcanic rocks out in the middle of the Pacific, 1,000 kilometers away from the Ecuadorian mainland, and basically never had any humans living on it till the 1800s. And that island there in the middle, the roundish one in the middle where I live now, had never had a human being alive on it till the 1920s. So very new. In 1998, this boundary was put all around it. And this is that first policy initiative that said no fisherman can fish within those boundaries other than local-based small-scale fishermen. So outlawed industrial fishing and outlawed all kinds of fishing by local fleet that could be damaging. But it didn't take too long, despite that, into that 2004 when that bumping along the bottom started, that most of the lobsters were isolated in populations way over to the western part of the archipelago. Very expensive to get there, the farthest away from the four little coastal towns that exist, and the market value had dropped to probably around 400,000. These are estimates; they're not exact amounts, but about $400,000 for that relatively small catch that I showed you early. And what's been absolutely key to making the change is this: spatial management. Spatial management means distributing economic activities in a way where each can get maximum benefit while not undoing the value that is derived from other activities. In other words, where there are incompatibilities. And what this sort of zoning can allow you to do, and what's happened with the zoning I'm showing you now is actually just 2 years old, is it distributes fishing in that blue zone. These are areas where it can be controlled. And then in the green areas, those are areas where no fishing is allowed. This was a major jump forward for Galapagos, so that now 30% of the entire marine reserve is in what's called no-take zones. So tourism activities can happen, but you can't extract. You can't take fish, and much less sharks or anything else. And this story isn't only about the recovery of lobster, but what has happened is those lobsters have started redistributing around the rest of the islands, and the value is now inching its way up to around $4 million. So about a tenfold increase, not only because of the increased catch, but the increased value of this higher value live lobster to the local market, as opposed to those lower value tail exports. And even more importantly, virtually all that money is now retained within the Galapagos themselves, because there's no middlemen to export it out to other locations. But the story is not only about the $4 million of lobster, although that's really important, and that's been critical to, as the title of this talk says, to building prosperity in Galapagos for fishermen. But it's about this. It's about all these boats and the $200 million that underpins the entire economy, and that the Ecuadorian president has identified as the pathway for the development of the country, to wean itself off of a fundamentally oil exporting nation to an ecotourism nation. The nation becomes less like Venezuela and more like Costa Rica, basically. And so the idea is now that these tourism operations buy that lobster, and very importantly to me, as a coffee farmer, they've also become the markets for the sustainable agricultural zones, those orange areas on the 4 inhabited islands. So that's only 3% of the total land area. It's actually a little smaller than what you're seeing here. But as a farmer, I know that for me to try to compete with a lot of land and a lot of labor and lots of seeds and right tapped into markets on mainland Ecuador, there's no way I can make money that way. But if I've got a local market that's willing to pay a premium price for a sustainably produced lettuce or coffee or chocolate or all the things that we do on our farm, it really creates a virtuous cycle where that same tourism market locally is thriving through being in an environment that's healthy, and they are keeping it that way by paying for a higher value for a product that's produced sustainably. So to kind of put it all together, what we've learned in the Galapagos and many other places around the world, our last 30 years of work as CI and now over 50 countries, is that you got to put all this stuff together. It can't only be about science. We had great science back in the 80s and 90s, and science allows you to understand problems, but it's policy, whether it's detailed governmental public policy or sometimes corporate policy, you got to move science into the management realm. And policy directs management. And management has to be more than just enforcement, telling people what they can't do. It's got to be setting up incentives so that they do the things that are in their interest to do. And that's the kind of work that we did in Galapagos with all those partners. And that's what makes this, I think, a great success story, one of many across CI. So basically, to pivot to the whole Sustainable Landscapes and Seascapes initiative, what are we trying to do with this? We're trying to build nature-based prosperity in some of the world's most important places. We are a conservation organization, so when we look at these places, and I'll show you a map here shortly, we're looking for places where nature has indisputable high value, but moreover, where the people who live there have a very direct relationship with nature and have, like those lobster fishermen and like the people in Galapagos, the opportunities to become stewards to protect that value. In other words, it's not about CI protecting places, it's about CI helping change systems, so it's in the interest of the people who live there to protect them. It's in their interest. And secondly, it's even if we were to have success in the 16 places, let alone Galapagos, the 16 places around the world where we work in the Sustainable Landscapes and Seascapes initiative, it's not enough. They're very important. I'll show you some summary data at the end of the presentation. But what we need to show is that across a wide range of places with all kinds of problems and all kinds of environments and different cultures and governance systems, that it can be done. There are win-win solutions out there. And the best way to get there is through unleashing the stewardship potential of people. So to wrap that all up into a map, what I've told you about now is the Galapagos, which is just one part of the Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape. As you'll have seen from my own title, this is the program I started in CI 14 years ago that I still manage to this day. And Galapagos is a really important part, but there are many others in Colombia, Costa Rica, and Panama, Cocos Island, Malpelo, Coiba, and Panama, where we're learning these same kinds of lessons. But it wasn't only the ETPS that has contributed to kind of the core material and learning to develop this initiative. There were these three other places. Abrolhos, in fact, we were working in Abrolhos on the Atlantic coast of Brazil before we were working in the ETPS. It's one of our oldest programs. And with the very generous support of the Walton Family Foundation, along with the ETPS, Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape, we worked in the Bird's Head Seascape, a great success story and a beautiful place to visit, as well as the Verde Island Passage in the Philippines, part of a broader initiative called the Sula-Sulawesi Seascape. And so these were kind of the marine progenitors of the whole idea of the Sustainable Landscapes and Seascapes initiative, but there are also two very important landscapes, and these are the ones. These also with great support from a number of donors, Walton Family Foundation, U.S. Agency for International Development, Disney, and others. We developed a lot of similar learning in these landscapes. In the Alto Maya, we learned a lot about coffee. In North Sumatra, we learned a lot about oil palm. And in our seascapes, of course, we've learned a lot about fishing, as I've explained with the lobster story. So what we've done is we've taken all this collective learning and we've expanded that to a global portfolio of 16 places around the world. 16 places where we had enough knowledge about the environment to say this is indisputably an exceptionally important place on Earth to save. And we believe that the human dependency on nature and the productive activities that are occurring in those places are things that we can work with, things where, like the Galapagos story, we can rejig the system and help people benefit, and through benefiting become the stewards of their own landscapes. So I'll just wrap up with a few brief slides and show you a little bit about how the Sustainable Landscape and Seascape Initiative is being framed. For all 16 of these sites, we've developed, obviously, you've got to start with a map, you got to know where you're working. And in each one of these, a key part of it is our protected area network. Conservation International has a long history of working in terrestrial protected areas, indigenous areas, marine protected areas, and a whole bunch of other categories where certain kinds of use are permissible, but uses that are compatible with environmental protection. And so we outline those. You can see all those red dots over and polygons over on the left side. Those are all the protected areas, many of which were established with the support of the Walton Family Foundation and many other of our great supporters over the last 14 years. And then what we do is we also map what we call the critical natural capital. What's the environments, what are the environments or the habitats, the ecosystems that are most critical to human well-being? And in our area, mangroves are exceptionally important. We have a very strong focus on mangroves. So we map that, we estimate the loss rates, we set targets, we implement strategies to make sure that we don't lose any more mangroves. And indeed, our goal in the Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape is to see a positive net gain. And in two of our countries, in Costa Rica and Ecuador, we're already seeing positive net gains, and we hope to use the examples and the learning from there to achieve similar results in Panama and Colombia. Then on the right, in each of these places, we've put those seascapes and landscapes into a regional perspective. You can see the size of the ETPS, Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape, is immense. It's 2 million square kilometers. It's about the size of the entire eastern United States east of the Mississippi. So I've mentioned a lot about production. I took a few slides out that told to go a little bit more in the weeds as far as how we measure some of these, but I did leave this one in because, as in the case of the lobster story, a lot of times the issue is how do you manage the things that are interacting with the environment to result in environmental degradation. That's ultimately what you got to do, is you got to work with the productive activities like we did with the lobster fishermen to stop the loss of the ecosystems that produce the clean water, the fresh air, and the food, and all the things we need. And so for each of the 16 sustainable landscapes and seascapes, we've done a threat assessment, some very detailed and with very rigorous methodologies, other through consultations and a general consensus on what those are. And the four big ones in the Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape are illegal fishing and unsustainable fishing, which is different because you could fish perfectly legally, but it could still be unsustainable. That wouldn't be a very good set of laws, but that happens. Coastal development, lots of economic growth in Latin America now, and that, of course, results in all sorts of infrastructure development, which needs to be managed in a way that doesn't underpin the values of nature. And then specifically the mangrove degradation I mentioned before. And I just wanted to bring up one example of how we actually measure that in practice, and is we've come up with quite a comprehensive system or methodology for defining what sustainability means when we're talking about fisheries. We've assessed 8 fisheries against these criteria. With those assessments, we build partnerships with other organizations, as I explained, the partnership in Galapagos, and then fisheries improvement projects are begun with communities at the forefront of those. And then we've developed a business planning methodology to find ways to bring in different kinds of capital to pay for those fishery improvement projects. And so, although lobster in Galapagos is certainly inching in, if not already in the green area, some of the other areas where we work with lobster are not doing as well. And that's where we plan to learn from that experience in the Galapagos. Tuna at our local sites does very well. We don't see signs of problems. That's in particularly true of Colombia, coastal Colombia. Other species go from corvina and snappers, not looking good at all. These need a lot of work and are going to take time. And then some of the other whitefish, Brodella and Merluza, grouper relative, are in that yellow zone too. So the plan is, or what we're doing is, we're measuring progress against a rigorous set of criteria for what does sustainability constitute practice. We need to get all those into the green zone. So that's just an example of how we're going to apply that learning from lobster and Galapagos to get up into the green zone and know that our production in these other areas is working. We're doing it with a very generous support of the Blue Action Fund, German government-funded initiative. For each of these 16 sustainable landscapes and seascapes, we know it's not for CI to be in these places forever. But I do want to say that we're talking, one of the hallmark features of the Sustainable Landscapes and Seascape Initiative, as we've done the Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape, as we've done with the Galapagos program, and I think as we've done in many of our other places, it's about commitment. You don't win a project for 3 years, run in, do a little bit of science, and run on to the next best thing. You don't just go into a place and work on policy, or just work on management, or even just work on markets. We need to make a decadal-long commitment to these places to set those goals for sustainability, reach broad-based agreements with a full range of stakeholders across government, protective society, communities, academia, and our NGO partners, and bring those places with those partnerships through to what we call the phase-out stage. So our estimate is, for each of those 16 places, we're talking about a decadal commitment, about 10 years, some more, as in the case of the larger places like the ETPS, Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape, and some maybe a little less. And that commitment gets up around $50 million per site. So it's not a small commitment, but I think it's the kind of thing that we've learned as an organization over the years. You got to put your hands in the fire and hold yourself accountable for our ambitious goals. And I think this holds us to a very ambitious one and a very important one. And I think we should be proud of the fact that we can say with confidence just how big that commitment is. And that's what this slide tries to do. So just to wrap up with a couple final slides, across all those 16 sustainable landscapes and seascapes that you saw on that map before, we will measure at least 4 things in all of them. Every one of those sites is going to have specific things it needs to measure. For example, how do you measure human well-being? But in the end, we need to know how many people are benefiting in one form or another based on the measure that's appropriate to that society and that set of problems for each of those landscapes and seascapes. As I've said, protected areas are critical. We are convinced as an organization, national parks, marine protected areas, marine management areas, locally managed areas, municipal managed areas are fundamental core parts of any successful nature-based development system. So we're going to measure that. How much area is protected and how well is it managed? Tons of carbon stored, a critical part of our climate strategy. We need to measure that. That's largely a conversion factor from those critical ecosystems. And then we need to look at ecosystem health as a whole. We have tools like the Ocean Health Index, the Freshwater Health Index. We can use things like our fishery sustainability scorecard that I talked about in the previous slide. So if we take that portfolio as a whole, all 16 of those sites, this is what it amounts to. The whole portfolio is about 3 million kilometers in size, 3 million square kilometers. Again, that's the size east of the eastern United States. That's because the Eastern Tropical Pacific is by far the largest one, about 2/3 of that total size right there. About 38 million people in those 16 places. We've estimated about 3 million, or about 10% of those 38 million, are direct beneficiaries of the work we're doing now. Of all those protected areas across those 16 areas, it's about 800,000 square kilometers. Imagine that's 100 times the size of Yellowstone, America's second largest national park. And one of the interesting things we found when analyzing the data for these 16 places is that we're pleased to see that in most of these places we're already seeing a declining loss rate. But bear in mind that a declining loss rate means it's still being lost. It just means it's not being lost as fast. But the fact that the rate is slowing, like human population growth on the planet, means that we're moving in the right direction. That gives us hope. And then finally, if we look at only the 10 landscapes, not the 6 seascapes in the portfolio, but the 10 landscapes, if we could stop the loss of critical ecosystems, those important things drawn on those maps that I showed earlier, that would be the equivalent of taking 20 million cars per year off the road. And that's because the emissions that result from deforestation and other kinds of ecosystem loss are as great as the emissions that are coming out of all of our cars every day. In the case of these 10 landscapes, that's 20 million that would be taken off the road. The 5 productive activities we often encounter in these sites are palm oil, fish, coffee, as I mentioned before, but also cassava and rice, especially with smallholders. So just to wrap up with the last slide, what we're trying to do, and I think this slide really does a good job of kind of capturing it, is we're trying to build a self-sustaining virtuous cycle of stewardship in these places. And I think that's what this picture shows. This is the entire society of Galapagos doing a lobster parade. And this whole program was called Take Care of What's Ours for Ourselves, because that's ultimately what it's about. It's about people identifying with nature, recognizing the benefits that they get from it, and stepping up and say, I'm going to take care of what's mine for myself. And that's what this parade. Incidentally, this was a few years ago. This same sort of parade and large cook-offs and theater productions just happened in Galapagos last week, because we still run the program, which is very important. And kind of to boil all this down to the 3 key needs to make this work is people have to see benefits from nature conservation. People are tired of being told it's their ethical duty, it's their moral obligation when they're trying to put food on the table and put their kids to school. Second of all, we need to find value propositions like we did with the lobster. There has to be a way for a government to get elected on a platform to work with groups like us, there has to be a value proposition of some kind for them to invest public funds in nature conservation. And there almost always is. And our job is to find out what that is. And then finally, and as the picture shows, many of the cultures and the places we work have always identified with nature. Most of those people have lived in those places. Not true of Galapagos, but many they have. But in many cases, they've lost that direct contact with nature, moved into cities, and no longer feel an intimate part of nature. And that's why it's so important to rebuild that interface between people and nature so that they identify it with it, they benefit from it, and they become the stewards for it. So thanks so much for all your attention. I hope that's given you a little bit of a taste for what we're doing in Galapagos, what we've been doing, how we've transferred that across to our new global initiative that I'm also have the pleasure of heading up. And if any of you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, for that wonderful presentation on our work in the Galapagos and, more importantly, the amazing conservation story. So we now have time to answer any questions that you may have. We actually did get one question in here, and it's very prevalent to what's going on today. But in light of the recent findings that the oceans are holding far more CO2 than we thought, and therefore warming is progressing faster, what thoughts do you have on how our priorities need to shift?
Yeah, well, that is a great question, and I am aware of this. And there's several things in that observation. One of them is the increased levels of CO2. What this causes ocean acidification, and one of the greatest problems with ocean acidification is that puts coral reefs, it stresses coral reefs and results in their degradation. And it also, more worryingly, can affect some of the great producers of oxygen on Earth, which are diatoms. And this is a major problem. And the temperature-wise is also a big issue because it changes things like the distribution of fish. It can change behavioral patterns of animals and migratory routes. And so what can we do about it? Well, at the global scale, we need to look at mitigation measures. So I talked to you about one of the things we're doing as CIs. We're measuring the amount of carbon that's being stored in all the ecosystems we protect. And that's our contribution. We know it's one contribution amongst many. And for all of you that are aware of the Paris Accords, this is why those are so critical. And that's why it's so important to get behind those. And the reason is because that's the place where governments commit to increasing their store of carbon, or decreasing their emissions, I should say. And that's ultimately the solution, is we need less carbon in the atmosphere. And that takes a very concerted effort, and it's very critical. And I'm sure you all know over the next few days we have important decisions to make on how we're going to pursue those goals. Secondly, what we can do is we need to build resilience into systems. So we may not be able to stop increasing acidification of oceans or warming of oceans, but what we can do is we can increase ocean health through things like recovering fish stocks and improving fishing techniques so that bycatch doesn't occur with species. We can reduce pollution into the oceans and things that affect ocean health, because a sick ocean that's then acidified is under even greater threat. Another thing we can do is really double down on our support for marine protected areas. And that's where we can really get the resilience in place, because these are places that nations around the world have already set are our priorities. We can also increase the coverage of marine protected areas so more places get that targeted protection that they need from governments and all the many supporters that are out there to keep them healthier and more resilient. And then finally, one of the things we can do is we can try to find ways to get governments to work together towards shared goals and transboundary management. This is especially true on transboundary fish stocks. If we can't find ways to manage these huge populations of species that move across boundaries, then it's very difficult to keep ocean health in place. And I guess I would mention even one more, which is we need to do the hard science to predict where these refugia are going to be. So under acidification and underwarming oceans, we can start to predict where will the most apt habitats be and the best locations be for things that are moving populations, populations that are trying to gradually over time migrate into places with more amenable conditions. So there are a lot of things we can do. It is a major problem, but the bottom line is we either reduce CO2 or ecosystems are going to be stressed. And this is why things like the Paris Accords are so important.
Thank you so much, Scott. We do have another question here. What selection criteria were used to choose these 16 sites as opposed to the many other great places CI works? Are they no longer important?
Well, that's a great question. I can certainly tell you that our many field programs, we work in over 30 countries now, and obviously not all those 30 countries are represented in that portfolio of 16 initial portfolio sites. And that doesn't diminish in any way the value of the site-based conservation work we're doing in all those countries that are not part of this initial portfolio of sustainable landscapes and seascapes. So what we looked for were places where we believed we had a level of knowledge about the place, as I mentioned before, where we said, there is really indisputable large-scale natural capital at risk or ecosystems at risk. And we understand the governance system, the cultural system, the commodities at work well enough to say that we can work beyond the site level to the landscape level, or rather many of our country programs are going to work in a relatively small area on a shorter term project cycle. But in those places where we know that we're working across multiple jurisdictions, multiple project sites, we have partnerships in place with multiple governments, maybe the national government, local governments, and they're all linked through a system. Those are the places we opted to initially work in. We also looked for a balance between our three field divisions, our Africa, Madagascar, our Southeast Asia, and Western Pacific, and our Americas division, because we want these beacons on the hill to be relevant to all those continents. We also took into account the fact that in some of those places we have quite large initiatives underway already. So the lift we need to make as an organization to really get off the ground and move across these multiple fronts that I mentioned of science, policy, management, markets, and sustaining impact, we knew we could take that on fairly confident because we already had some good push. And then finally, I just mentioned we looked for balance between ecosystems. We wanted reasonable balance between terrestrial systems, marine systems, and freshwater systems, grassland systems, because the idea, again, is that the portfolio as a whole allows us to draw on those 30 years of experience, but also to generate new models that are relevant not only to different geographies, but to different ecosystem types.
Thank you so much, Scott, for thoroughly explaining that. We do have time for one more question, and it looks like we have one here. So, and this might be especially prevalent if anyone is looking to travel to the Galapagos. Is tourism in Galapagos really sustainable, or is this a case of being loved to death, such that tourism is killing the goose that laid the golden egg?
I think this question is important beyond Galapagos, because clearly for so many of our sustainable landscapes and seascapes, tourism is a real option. Nature tourism, ecotourism, and by definition, ecotourism needs to kind of hit that triple bottom line of the social, the environmental, and it has to be economic viable as well. It has to have that value proposition I mentioned before. In the case of Galapagos, as I said, I've been there 35 years now, coming up on 36 this year. And I just gave a talk, in fact, to quite a large audience in Panama last week about exactly this topic. And I think the jury is still out on where it's going to go in the long run. But I think there are lots of signs that it's going the right direction. The big issue in Galapagos is whether the tourism is growing at a rate that becomes such an economic driver that it continues to pull immigration out, such that the local populace grows and grows and grows, the resource demands and the waste that are produced and the requirements to protein from fish or whatever it may be are going to get so high that it's going to start to undermine environmental integrity. But I really, truly believe in the case of Galapagos, I absolutely believe that the system is moving in the right direction. I think that Ecuador is going to use, Ecuador and many of these places, they're going to use these areas one way or another. And the question is, are they willing to invest the amount of money that it takes? In the case of Galapagos, it's just reinvesting the revenues it already produces, a small part of those revenues, back into management. That was my core message at that Panama meeting. And I think in the case of Ecuador, they are. And some of the evidence I would give for this is, I don't know the exact numbers, but the budget for the Galapagos National Park was in the low millions in the late 90s. I think the last time was around $15 million a year. The number of park guards is up from, under 100 to about 280. A massive comprehensive quarantine system has been put together. Its 6th anniversary was just the other day. That little boy on the horse that I showed at the beginning, he was the guest pianist for the Biosecurity Agency of Galapagos, and they've invested from a few dozen people now, and they've got over 200 people working in there. So I think, and very importantly, extremely strict rules about immigration have been put in place in Galapagos. I know, because it's virtually impossible for me to get labor to work on my farm now, because they've really cracked down on immigration to Galapagos through a system where you can't move to Galapagos, even if you're Ecuadorian, without a permit and a contract and a very complicated procedure. So in short, got to keep an eye on it. It's a very serious issue, but I sincerely believe that you can go to Galapagos now, confident that you are part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Well, thank you again, Scott, so much for presenting on our work in the Galapagos today. If you have any other questions, we can certainly address them. Please feel free to send them to me directly, as you'll see my contact information on the screen. A special thank you again to Scott for sharing this important work with us. Thank you all for connecting and hearing more about our work in the Galapagos and empowering people to protect the nature we all depend on. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if I can answer any questions you may have. As a reminder, this session was recorded, and we will be sending you the recording as well as further information on the Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape Initiative. Please feel free to share it with your friends, networks, etc. Thank you again for joining us, and please stay tuned as our next webinar is tentatively scheduled for late winter in the new year in 2019. Thank you all for your wonderful support of Conservation International and for your time today. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.